When it comes to investing in precious metals, you need a source you can trust who offers you choices and empowers you to maximize your wealth. That's where Roberts & Roberts Brokerage can help. Roberts & Roberts is a trusted name in precious metals. Since 1977, Roberts & Roberts has been providing you with the finest gold and silver bullion, coins, rounds, and bars at genuine and honest prices. They make it easy to invest in precious metals and work with you to suit your investment needs. In addition to offering gold and silver for sale for US dollars, Roberts & Roberts Brokerage is now accepting Bitcoin in exchange for their quality precious metals products. To speak with a professional from Roberts & Roberts about investing in precious metals, call toll-free 800-874-9760. Write this number down, 800-874-9760. Visit Roberts & Roberts online at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. On behalf of Roberts & Roberts, here's hoping your day is as good as gold.
If you don't know who I am, my name is Davi Barker. People know me from dailyanarchist.com, bitcoin.bombs.com. I do some work for Silver Circle. I'm essentially a writer and an artist in the liberty movement. So I want to begin with kind of an explanation about how I ended up here talking about psychology. There's an expression among Holocaust survivors that no one survived the Holocaust. Not one German, not one Jew, not one Gypsy, not one homosexual. No one survived the Holocaust because living in German fascism so destroyed everyone that no one was the person that they were born to be. And when I heard that, what occurred to me immediately was no one survives the state. And it led me to think about, how have I failed to survive the state? Like, how have I, my life, how am I not the person that I'm supposed to be because of growing up in this system? And what I had to admit to myself was, I'm only a writer and I'm only an artist because at a young age I saw how screwed up the system was, and I saw art and writing as a way to change that. So really I wasn't supposed to be a writer or an artist. And then I started thinking, what was I before I saw how screwed up the system was? I was interested in science. Well, it's a little late in the game for me to go back to school and get a degree in some sort of science, but I'm an agorist, so I don't care about the university certificate. And so I'm totally unqualified for what I'm about to present.
No, you're totally qualified. Your mind hasn't been polluted with their bullshit.
Well, thank you. So since we're talking about authority, I want to make it perfectly clear this is not a classroom. I'm not a teacher. You can interrupt as much as you want. You can leave to use the restroom if you want. You don't have to raise your hand. So you don't have to raise your hand. So you guys can, you know, if I make a mistake or whatever, just yell back at me. It's totally fine. We're all equals here. So I want to talk about why, among all the Okay. So among all the sciences, why psychology? And the reason is because, as many of you maybe are familiar with this model, factually speaking, the state doesn't exist. The government exists. There are tanks, there are police, there are pieces of paper that things are written on, and they displace water and they melt at certain temperatures and they burn at certain temperatures, and you can study them with the conventional physical sciences. The state does not exist. The state can only be studied with soft science, like psychology, like sociology, like metaphysics. Like, you know, so the reason to study psychology if you're interested in libertarianism or anarchy is because, factually speaking, your enemy only exists in the mind. So if you're going to fight him or it, you have to fight it there. You can have all the cameras and all the votes and all the rifles in the world, but if you're not attacking it in the mind, it doesn't matter. It's still there, because it's probably in your mind.
Your mind.
So libertarians and anarchists who are familiar with the psychology of obedience and the psychology of authority are mostly familiar with the Stanford prison experiment and the Milgram experiment. I'm seeing a lot of nods in the room, so I'm guessing most of you are familiar with these experiments. But just to briefly summarize, the Stanley Milgram experiment is an experiment where subjects were randomly separated as either teachers or learners, and teachers were instructed to give learners an electroshock if they answered questions incorrectly. And the test was to see how much voltage would somebody deliver to a subject if they were instructed to by a scientist in a lab coat. And what the teacher didn't know is that the learner was fake, and that the electroshocks were fake, and that they were the subject of the experiment. Stanley Milgram's contemporaries at the time thought that 1% of people would comply with this, and it turned out that 65% of people, at least in the first iteration of the experiment, delivered a lethal 450-volt shock to a complete stranger because a scientist said, the experiment requires that you continue. So this is not legal authority. This is not, there's no consequences if this person...
What percentage of subjects refuse to participate at all?
They could just leave.
Okay.
A lot of them...
How many people did that?
refused to participate at all, like didn't push the button once, was 1%.
When they were probably participate, we don't know. But they initially agreed, they were the teacher, and then they realized what they're doing and said, thank you, I'm leaving. How many people did that, if anybody?
Well, it's the opposite of 65%. It'd be 35%. No, I guess if you want, do you know this? We have Brian here. Brian is a real psychology student, and so he might be able to field that question.
Yeah, well, the problem with that question, I'm not saying it's a bad question, is that they actually did many different versions with slightly different variations on instructions, the screams of pain coming from the actor who was playing the learner. But the percentage he's giving, they always were reporting the percentage of people who were willing to deliver the largest level of shock, to go all the way to the button at the end labeled with XXX, and that they were told was very dangerous. So the remaining percentage stopped somewhere else. There were some people who refused as soon as they realized it was painful to the person, but very few. Others stopped when the person was screaming and pleading.
That is my question.
So.
People who realize that they cause pain in minimal pain.
If you're
The people who quit very early was just a small handful, typically.
If you're interested in like the full scope of the experiment itself, Stanley Milgram's book is called Obedience to Authority: An Experimental View.
I really don't read all the crazy details.
Okay, well that's where
I just want to know this small percentage who refuse at the very early stage, long before the XXX 400.
Okay, if you want to leave me, I know that 1% refused. It was 1% that refused as soon as they realized they were hurting the person, and I know that nobody insisted that the experiment be halted. But if you want to leave me your email, I know where to find that statistic, and I can let you know when I get home, if that's all right. That's excellent. So Stanford prison experiment is essentially it's 20 college students screened for mental health who are randomly assigned as either prisoner or guard, and they're put into a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford psychology building to study prison psychology. And it was supposed to go on for 2 weeks, and they halted it after 6 days when they realized that there were instances of torture occurring. And specifically, Philip Zimbardo, he's the scientist who was running it, said that he too was compromised by the psychology of the experiment because he had assigned himself prison warden in the mock prison. And so he was on the side of the guards, and he allowed torture to continue longer than he should have. And so these are the two big experiments. People are pretty familiar with them, but there's a number of experiments since then that that people don't know about. And so those are the ones that I want to primarily talk about. And what's interesting about these is that after the Stanford prison experiment and the Milgram experiment, the ethical guidelines on experimentation were changed. So these new experiments, although they give us the results that we would expect, they're not as dramatic. But I still think that we should be talking about them. What's that?
They should be as dramatic.
They should be as dramatic.
Yeah, well, the people are going through that shit anyway. Why not?
Hear me out. So the first one I want to talk to is called How Power Corrupts, or Power and Deception by Dana Carney. And what she hypothesized was that power was what she called a stress buffering mechanism, which meant that there are these normal stressors that we experience that can be measured when we're lying, and that people in high power positions wouldn't exhibit them. So she established power with a personality test. Random subjects came to the experiment, they were given a personality test, and they were told that they either tested as high power or low power individuals. But this was random. The purpose of the personality test was just to give it legitimacy, right? Because legitimacy is what makes power possible. So you have half of them assigned as leaders, you have half of them as assigned as subordinates, and then they're given 1 hour of busy work. Leaders get to work in an executive office, and subordinates get to work in a small windowless cubicle, and they do busy work for an hour, after which they have a mock negotiation over wage. And the purpose of all of that is just so that they have established themselves as leaders or subordinates. Then half of them are given an opportunity to steal $100. And all they have to do to steal this $100 is lie in the exit interview. And if they can convince the scientist, the person giving the exit interview that they've lied, they can keep the $100 bill. And the exit interviewee doesn't know who has the $100 bill. But while they're doing this, they are hooked up to some, I guess this isn't the EKG one. They're tested emotionally. They're given self-reporting emotional surveys before and after. They test their cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone you can get from a saliva test, so their stress, that's to see how stressed out they are. They're given what's called the Stroop Test, which is sort of a computerized test of reaction time. So you test it before the incident and you test it after the incident, and you get a reading on how sort of cognitively impaired they are from lying. And then you have video of the interviews that they say give sort of nonverbal cues like pursing your lips or shrugging your shoulders or increased word speed, things like that. So in every measure, the high power individuals who were lying measured the same as the high power or low power individuals who were telling the truth. So they showed no stressors from lying. But the low power individuals who were lying showed all of these behavioral and physiological clues that they were lying. So in a sense, I mean, maybe not 100%, but liars can pass a lie detector test, for example, maybe, or whatever. But the only place where they differed from truth tellers was the self-reporting emotional survey. In the self-reporting emotional survey, high-powered liars reported pleasure.
Sweet.
So they actually enjoy lying if they're in high-power positions.
So they're psychopaths.
Because they're psychopaths.
No, really, that's what it is.
But they were randomly chosen. This is that. Thank you for reminding me. That is the important thing. These are not authentically high-powered individuals. These are people randomly selected to do 1 hour of work in an executive office. Yeah, they were told they could that they had to convince the scientists that they didn't have the $100 bill.
Well, the point is, they behave psychopathically just by playing the role of being
Right. So it isn't just that power attracts corruption; it's that power induces corruption. Right, and that's what you see in the Stanford experiment, the Milgram experiment. That's what you see here, is that it is literally that power corrupts. It's not that the evil people in society gravitate toward government. It's that having the government corrupts good people that end up there.
Were
right?
there any exceptions? Any people in the experiment who were designated?
Of course, these are all sort of generalized statistics. These
Same
aren't.
question, what percentage were exceptions?
I don't remember.
Ask the same question over again. I want to find a straw to catch on. This is some potential. This 1% of humanity is uncorruptible.
I don't think that they're. Well, that hasn't been found experimentally, at least. But there's sort of a catch I'm getting to, that
If half of the group is designated as leaders, given executive office, that act in a corrupt manner, if 1% of them, in spite of all that, did not lie and were truthful, that gives you hope.
what's their background? I do know something about the Stanford prison experiment, that the two prisoners who resisted the most were an evangelical Christian and a communist. And the reasoning was that the speculation on the part of Philip Zimbardo was that it's because they had strong core identities of their own. And that when people go into this scenario and they're given an identity by someone else, they'll adopt it if they don't have a strong creed of their own.
Two of the prisoners.
Two of the
None
prisoners,
Of the guards?
not of the guards.
Wasn't there some people who opted out right away when they started the prison experiment?
I don't think so.
Not enough.
There
They-
wasn't opt-out.
I don't
They
think-
could leave at any time.
they-
Nobody left.
Right, they were all told that they could leave, but the prison experience generated a kind of camaraderie in the group, and they felt that they were betraying the other prisoners if they left.
Yeah.
Even though they were told repeatedly that they were free to leave, and yeah. So same with the Milgram experiment. In the Milgram experiment, people wanted to leave, in the Milgram experiment. People wanted to leave, and people began showing these signs of incredible distress and not wanting to, and they offered the money back. They said, I don't want to participate in this experiment anymore, right? And they would offer the money back. And the scientists would just say, the experiment requires that you continue, which is not an order. It's just sort of like, it's verbal prodding by an authority figure, right? And they continued. I mean, most of them. So the next one I want to talk to is called Power and Distress, which I don't think is a very good title, because distress is measured in all these experiments. I call it Power and Compassion. But this is by Gerben A. van Cleef, who is from the University of Amsterdam. And he aimed to determine whether there's a disparity in high power and low power individuals as far as reciprocal emotional response. So this time, subjects were given a personality test, only this one was not random. This was actually intended to identify them as high power or low power individuals in their real life. And then they were randomly paired with each other to share an emotionally traumatic experience, to essentially tell stories to one another of personal pain, of suffering, of something like that, while hooked up to an electrocardiogram, an EKG machine, to measure their stress while they're talking to each other. And what they found was that first off, low power individuals who are listening to the suffering of others have a reciprocal measurement in the electrocardiogram. They experience higher stress when the other person experiences higher stress. So simply the verbal connection causes a physiological connection that you could associate with compassion. They're experiencing stress because the other person is experiencing stress. High power individuals do not experience this, or did not in a statistically significant way. John?
Can you explain a little bit more about what makes a high power individual? You know, like MLK would be considered a high power individual, I would imagine.
Yeah, I don't have a copy of the test itself. But I think that in this particular survey, it was how they thought of themselves. So it's a matter of self-reporting. So it isn't necessarily that like they're all like politicians or they're all CEOs or something like that. It is how they feel about themselves in their own life.
It's traditionally a locus of control perspective. People who believe that they control what happens in their own destiny are high power. People who believe that it's the external forces that kind of like draw them into wherever they're going.
Right.
Or low power.
Well, that's almost negative then, if that's the case, because we want people to have their sort of own locus of control. But
but people who say, well, I just kind of like go along and get along.
Yeah.
Those are low power people. People who say, well, I say where we're going.
Right.
Are high power.
Yeah, but I think we would have to look at the test, because
Yeah.
the test they used is what
What are the
determined high
questions?
and low.
In all of these experiments, those conditions are operationalized, so it means that the scientists decide what high power and low power means in each individual experiment. So
Yeah. So we'd have to look at the test. I don't have it here, unfortunately. Yeah.
Where they told them you're a high power.
Right. But yeah.
Nonetheless, the people who they selected as being the high-powered people turned out to be the ones that didn't have the stress response.
Right. The high power individuals don't have reciprocal stress response. Right. The other thing that
After the test, were they told whether they tested high or low?
Yeah, and the questionnaire after the test is sort of based on that. Oh, you mean after the test, not after the experiment?
I don't think they told them.
I don't think that they did. I think they probably got the results after the whole thing was finished, after the exit interview and everything. But no, that would bias the data. I can't imagine that they would do that. There's also an instance of self-reporting in this experiment. Again, they were given an emotional survey before and after about their experience of sharing their story with this person. But in this emotional survey, they were also asked to identify the emotions of their partner. And what that means is that high-power individuals successfully identified their partner's emotions. They just didn't respond. So it's not that they can't see the distress of others. It's that they see it and they don't respond, right? Which is they don't have a conscience. Yeah, they're psychopaths. We can keep coming back to that. The other issue was low-power individuals who are with a partner who are with high-power listeners. The story, or any storyteller, if a storyteller is with a high-power listener, they actually experience higher rates of stress when they're not receiving reciprocal emotion, if that makes sense. So if you're telling an emotional story and the other person's deadpan, it's actually more suffering for you than if the person was responding. Right. So if they're not actively sharing the story with you. So in that sense also, high power individuals could in some social sense cause greater suffering with their friends and family in their lives.
What was this thing called?
They called it power, distress, and compassion. I like just calling it power and compassion because all these experiments involve a measure of distress. So, but yeah, they're also all of the sort of notes on these are in this pamphlet you guys maybe have seen, but we're going to get beyond this in just a minute. I got one more of these experiments I want to tell you about. This is called Power and Hypocrisy by Joris Lammers and Adam Galinsky. And they aim to, so the way that they're measuring hypocrisy in this experiment is on a 9-point scale. You are asked to rate the moral infraction from 1 to 9 of minor traffic violations, minor tax evasions, and receiving of stolen property. And then you are sort of asked to rate it when someone else does it, and then you are sort of asked to rate it when you do it yourself. And the question is, what they're calling a measurement of hypocrisy is a disparity in that number. If you're harsh on other people and lenient on yourself, they call that hypocrisy. And in some people, they found that they were harsh on themselves and lenient on others, and so they invented the word hyperpocrisy, but that's just a made-up word. This is, again, people, this guy actually did a battery of 5 experiments, and the 5th one I think is the most important, and it's sort of like the silver bullet that I want to expand upon. But essentially, people are randomly assigned high power and low power in a number of different ways, and he comes up with some funny ways to do this. So sometimes it's randomly assigned, and then they're asked to recall an experience. So if you're randomly assigned power, your job is to tell a story about a time that you felt like you were in power. And if you're subordinate, then you're supposed to tell a story about a time that you felt you were disempowered. But he also did it with a word search. He played word games with people. So if you were a randomly assigned high power individual, you'd sit in a room, you'd play crossword puzzles and word searches and things like that for an hour, and all of the words in those games are high power words, and in the other group, all of those words are low power words. So you're just sitting in a room doing crossword puzzles, but the words are things like authority or power or control, and the other group is sitting in a room doing word puzzles, and their words are things like slave or maybe control goes both ways, I don't know. But so I mean, that struck me as a very unusual way to assign power roles, but it worked. The point is that the results still showed that high power individuals are more critical of people who speed than they are of themselves. They're more critical of people who do tax evasion than they are of themselves. And they're more critical. The example was a bicycle. If you found a bicycle in the road and you took it, and then later you found out that the bicycle was stolen, would you return the bicycle, or how would you rate the moral infraction of keeping the bicycle? And people rated keeping a bicycle for others as more vulgar than for themselves. And the high power individuals in all of these had that disparity, whereas the low power people, they were sort of closer to a median where they considered it the same. The only The interesting thing about this one is the 5th experiment in this battery of experiments. And so it's the same thing, randomly assigned, asked to recall a story, but he creates a 3rd category, and he asks people to recall a story where they were in a position of power that they didn't feel that they deserved. So there's an illegitimate power category in this experiment. And that's where they found what they call hypocrisy, that people who felt that their power was illegitimate were more harsh on themselves and less harsh on others. So they actually experienced the opposite of hypocrisy, and they were even below the low power group. So what makes that, I mean, this is just one experiment on hypocrisy, and it's not like very dramatic results because it's not a very dramatic experiment. But that distinction between legitimate and illegitimate power is so important that I think that it should be expanded upon. Because if that's true, if it's possible that causing somebody to suddenly think that their power is illegitimate actually gives them the opposite psychological response, that might carry over into all of the other experiments, right? Like that might reverse their willingness to cheat, reverse their willingness to lie, reverse their willingness, yeah.
For instance, in the Milgram experiment, they were then told that the scientist is not a scientist and all this stuff.
Yeah, he's a pizza delivery guy in a lab coat. Do you still want to obey him?
Then,
right,
for the pain they inflicted, then in their own situation.
That it might reverse. And in fact, they found that in the Stanford prison experiment, the only way that they could get them to leave the experiment, because the people didn't want to halt, the subjects did not want to halt the experiment, even when the scientists decided that it was time to, is that they had to keep being reminded that it's an experiment, not a prison. Because one of the rules in the beginning of the experiment was you cannot refer to it as an experiment, right? That was part of creating the world of the prison. The subjects could not refer to the prison as a laboratory or refer to the prison as an experiment. That was against the rules. You have to pretend it's real. So until the scientists began referring to it as an experiment, people were not willing to leave. And so I think that is an example of this undercutting of legitimacy. That once that enters their mind and they're like, oh, this is not a prison. Oh, I am not a prisoner. I am just a student in a laboratory. Then suddenly the power disappears, right? It sort of dispels.
We're all in a giant prison experience.
Yeah, we're all in a giant prison experience
And
now.
all we need to know is why the powers regionalized.
So I want to see a show of hands. How many of you have heard of Stanley Milgram experiment and Stanford prison experiment before this talk? So that's most of the room. I'd say that's all of the room. So how many of you have heard of Power and Compassion, Power and Hypocrisy, and Power and Deception before reading this or before attending this?
They had some on History Channel.
They did?
Yeah. It
Okay.
was pretty interesting.
I'll bet.
Is it the one where they made the different people from different socioeconomic groups play a lopsided game of Monopoly? So they took somebody who was poor and made them have like 3 times the amount of money in a 2-player Monopoly game, and that the person who was poor for most of their life started showing psychopathic, like, I'm not going to let you go by without paying the full tax on my hotel and all this other stuff.
Okay.
Where the richer people, they had to play the low hand. They showed empathy on everything.
So it reversed.
Yeah.
And when the power dynamic reverses. So yeah.
What I remember from that was very profound. What they said is that the people who are the best liars were also, maybe it was a different experiment, but they said the people who they did a questionnaire who everyone thought that was in the group thought was the leader, and then the leader was invariably the best liar. They also
Right.
was
That it correlated.
yeah, there was it was a direct correlation between the people, the best liars, and the ones who the group felt was the leader of the group.
Right. So the point that I'm making is that nobody's heard of these experiments. And the reason that I think that is the ethical guidelines. That because of the ethical guidelines that were passed after Milgram and Stanford were it's the APA, I guess.
Like they're not doing it someplace without revealing the data, I'm sure.
Well, so what it means is that these experiments are all very tame, and because they're tame, they don't sort of infect the culture. We don't see a whole lot of documentaries or books written about them, and it sort of becomes water cooler talk in the psychology wing of various universities, and we don't hear about it. So what I'm arguing is that means that we have to do them ourselves. That anarchists and libertarians are constantly saying, the APA regulations are not law, the APA regulations are ethical guidelines mostly that influence public funding. And as anarchists and libertarians, we should be against public funding anyway. So if we want to see a continuation of psychological research on obedience and authority, then we should be willing to fund it ourselves, and we should be willing to do it ourselves, and we shouldn't be relying on public universities. So this is where we're going now. So I have a proposal for an experiment, and it's on police brutality. So here's what I would like to do. I would set up, probably in a mall, if there's a way to get a more random sampling, that would be ideal. But the idea would be that you would sort of have a person, like a scientist with a clipboard, who is offering people in the population to participate in some sort of consumer report or product, sort of, come watch this movie trailer and tell me what you think about it. And so they walk down this hall, and at the end of the hall there's a door with a camera above it. The scientist makes some reference to the camera. They walk into this room, and then they're sitting in a waiting room. In the waiting room, there's a television screen. The television screen immediately references to the camera in the hallway, and the person sitting in the waiting room now knows that they're watching the hallway that they just came from. The scientist says some things, maybe he gets them to sign the clipboard, whatever we sort of decide needs to happen, but he says that he'll be right back. So he goes through a second door. This door has to say exit above it. So after some time that this person is sitting, once it's sort of clear that they've made the connection with the video screen, the scientist will come out with a previous participant in the survey, thank him for his service, and invite him to sort of leave out the main door. He'll collect the clipboard from the subject, and he'll go out the exit door, so 2 doors, opposite directions. As soon as the second person, who is a confederate of the experiment, walks through the door to leave, the video screen becomes a recording. The recording is an instance of police brutality. The subject sitting on the couch in the waiting room will see the person he just saw walk through the room, walk into the hallway, come onto the screen. He'll hear audio from the hallway, he'll see visual on the screen of this person being attacked by a police officer. And so the question is, how bad can this instance of police brutality get before a person will open that door? Because opening that door constitutes intervention. They don't have to physically assault anybody. They don't even have to be in the same room as the police officer. But if they were going to open that door, then that means that they intended to intervene. And at that point, you can sort of remove the curtain and you can enter into an exit interview and you can ask them, what were you planning on doing? Were you planning on yelling? Were you planning on filming? Were you planning on... Maybe you don't even know what you're going to do. Maybe you just know that you have to do something, right? So there's a couple of problems. Because we're abandoning the APA ethical guidelines, I think it's important that we write our own ethical guidelines. And so I'm looking for ethicists in the movement that I can consult with, because I'm not an ethicist, I'm an artist, like I said. So there are problems of trauma. The question is, how traumatic of a visual depiction can you present to a person and not be considered aggression by our standards? Because, I mean, at some point you are harming the person, I think.
I don't understand why we need ethics guidelines for psychological experiments if we're people that don't treat each other badly anyway.
You have to have definitions.
Well, yeah, you have to have
definitions.
because
Anyone who owns the definitions wins.
Because when I present this idea, a lot of people bring up an experiment called compliance. And in the compliance experiment, this is another example of a renegade psychological experiment. This wasn't approved by the APA. In fact, this guy is currently being hunted by the police. And
the world's most dangerous.
no, nothing like that. Well, this is what he did. He made phone calls to fast food restaurants. He asked to speak to a manager. He told the manager that he was a police officer, that one of their cashiers was holding drugs, and that that person needed to hold that person in the back room until the officer arrived. Then he proceeded to conduct strip searches of the cashier using the manager as a surrogate on location. And the question is, how much will the manager follow the orders of a police officer they've never seen on the phone? And the answer is that they strip search their employees. I don't know. There's a documentary coming out about this soon. It's already out. Well, it's called Compliance if you want to Google it. But this is completely unethical, and this is why I think that because if we're trying to build a voluntary society, that voluntary society is going to include scientific research, and scientific research is going to include ethical guidelines. It's going to include best standards of practices that are produced by the market. So, yeah?
Yeah, so I'm just curious about how you plan to design, or who, first of all, who's involved with the research? You know, of course, if you're doing science, you're trying to get at the truth. So, I mean, you would want, I assume, to have your team to be composed of people who are not necessarily anarchists.
Sure.
And even people who are opposed to anarchism. And people who are opposed to like egalitarianism and are skeptical of like flat organizations. So.
You mean as far as analysis of the results?
Everything, or design to analysis. But I mean, I'm not saying that it's. I think that's a fantastic idea, and I agree that public funding is bad for science in general. But it's just like you still want to have the rigor of.
Right. It's about the methodology, though. I mean, if the methods are sound, it doesn't matter what source you're coming from.
Well, but this I'm saying, okay. Even if it's not a matter of, even if it's not a matter of like the knowledge that you derive from it, in terms of its effectiveness as a study to like actually convince people.
Right.
I mean, you're fighting against the legitimacy of the APA and all these other institutions that we disagree that they have legitimacy, but the fact of the matter is that anarchists are illegitimate.
Sure.
And public funding is legitimate. So I'm just saying,
well,
bear these things in mind.
Except that the public accepts shows like Mythbusters and What Would You Do and Candid Camera and things like that. I feel like when the public has the ability to see the statistic and see the video and see the presentation for themselves and make it real, make it a documentary, make it a YouTube. Even television shows, 30 Days, I don't know if you've ever seen that show. That's essentially an experiment. It's not really scientifically rigorous, but people accept it. Right, because they've seen it.
And you don't have to.
You go, John. I'm sorry, John was next, and then Nick.
Yeah, I think it could potentially be harmful to the participants, especially if someone was a recent victim of police brutality,
right.
Or they grew up having their parents abuse them their whole lives. For them to be exposed to violence, I can even think of my fiance Catherine. She never watched television growing up, and whenever we watch movies where violence takes place, she has a physiological reaction, whereas I'm desensitized to it because I watched The Tube growing up. So I think that should be considered because we could be inserting people into a situation that could bring them emotional and even physical harm to their person. So that's definitely something we should explore.
What's that?
Could you have an alternate out?
There's an exit door. That's the reason for the exit door. So they don't have to intervene and they don't have to watch. There's an exit door. And they've seen people leave through that door. So, yeah, they know it's an
The other
option.
side is you can also, I'm sorry.
Can we, I'm sorry, I call, Nick was next. I'm sorry. He homesteaded this spot. So, Nick, what's up?
Just something just came to mind. You could, instead of like putting the camera like right in front of them, it could be around the corner where they can look and see. They know there's a camera there. They don't have to look at it. But if they want to look at it, it's there, but they can still hear it.
Yeah.
But my original.
So they actually have to move to see the camera.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they have some skirmishes.
Or the screen, not the camera.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is.
Yeah, I guess two things. You might get people to progress after the test to not have that data public. As far as especially if the reaction is something they don't want. It's kind of ethical.
So yeah, from a filmmaking perspective, you have to get waivers from anyone whose image or name that you want to use. But from a scientific perspective, I think the data, like as long as you're not including their personal information, their reaction becomes part of the data set. And I don't think there's anything unethical.
So, I mean, you might even ahead of time say you might film this or whatever, but you are kind of deceiving them about what you're doing. I mean, it is kind of proposals.
You're not deceiving them, you're not limiting their creativity, you're just giving them, you're just putting them in a situation that's cold and they don't expect it.
But they may not want their reaction on a documentary.
I can see somebody leaving the exit intending to intervene to find somebody outside the exit, just purely based on your experiment, there's somebody behind that door. So you might be saying out the exit, get somebody else to help them. Right, and another thing is doing the same experiment when it's not a cop, exactly the same thing.
Right. So I want to talk about that for just a second. The idea of using same video, not a cop. My ideal. I don't know. Have you guys seen Silver Circle? You guys kind of familiar with that animation? So the way that movie is done is actors are sort of wearing these neon green tennis balls, and they're in a green room, and they record the vector information of all of the motion of the actors. And then that information is brought into the computer and digitized, and the skins of the characters are laid over these wireframes of real people that they've captured using the green screen. So what I'd like to do ideally is have one episode of police brutality. So you're using the same motion for every video, for every instance, for every iteration of the experiment, and you can just lay different skins. So maybe it's a cop, maybe it's not. Maybe you could do black on white, male on female, straight on gay. You could do every iteration by changing the characters in the video. And because the motion is all the same, you have the same video. You don't have disparity in performances, so that you don't have that as a unintended variable in the reaction. But yeah, that is the point of the exit door, so that they have, that was the contribution of Ben Stone, that he suggested the exit door.
I think the guy that brought him in could be there to also, see if they're going to intervene in another way. Like, hey man, where's the guy to get up?
Right. Well, he knows the scientist is through the exit door.
Right.
So if he took the exit door in the closing interview, he might say that he was going to get help.
You need a prop.
You wouldn't necessarily know.
A prop?
Yeah, a diagram to show people what it looks like.
I think you actually
okay.
need that.
You might get people lying about it, because after
Yeah.
the fact, they might want to say.
You need the science or the guy.
Let's go Ernie. Ernie?
Instead of getting bogged down in the beginning of the result and the experiment and why to do it and all that, let's go ahead and walk it through. Tell us why you're even doing it, to what end, and then we'll get all detailed.
Well, sure. The goal is to have a fresh example of a psychological experiment on authority that is dramatic enough to impact the culture, so that we can demonstrate the power corrupts in a way that is not from the 70s. Because we're still calling on these old experiments that, I mean, the Milgram experiment was repeated, but the Stanford prison experiment was never repeated. And if you study it, it's not even that scientifically rigorous itself. So it's not really a great source of data. And so I'm suggesting, like, not only that we need fresh examples to influence the culture, to influence sort of people.
Right.
I'm trying to undermine public consciousness of legitimacy.
Yeah.
That's the point.
I love it.
Yeah?
Well, a fairly easy way to do this then is to use the YouTube phenomenon, which a very, very large percentage of the videos that are high rank in YouTube are prank videos.
Right.
So in this particular thing, you basically have a perfect prank. I mean, this person goes in and they're shown as, and so when they freak out, they're like, oh my God, and they run out.
You go, ha, I pranked you.
And then you actually could, and you could portray it as a prank. And then after you've done a series of prank videos, where you've got an ad campaign, so to speak, that, oh, come watch our pranks because they're cool. And then afterwards, you have like another video that goes,
I don't think you're going to have to sex this up to get people to watch it.
So I like it. I like the idea of setting it up as a YouTube channel or as a reality TV show or as something that the culture is familiar with to sort of digest. But before all of that happens, I think it's important to have like real scientists on board that make sure that the data set is scientifically rigorous. So you have both, right? Because one is good at affecting the culture and one is good at being real valid data.
Right. Another important thing in the volunteer society is role of adaptive behavior. And there was one YouTube video I saw that was pretty interesting where they had people in a room and they did a simple, but simple math problem on the board, and they had everyone except for one person who was the test subject give the wrong answer.
Right, it's a conformity study. This was, Brian suggested this, that you could do iterations of this same experiment with a group of people so that you have a sort of group dynamic. If you have either like a room of 10 subjects and like is that group large enough for them to intervene, or if you had a group of 10 subjects and 9 of them were confederates of the experiment who just followed whatever the subject did, or whatever. You get into sort of group psychology that way. Yeah, Morpheus?
You can also rate the people, they can self-rate themselves. Are you a liberal? Are you a conservative?
Right. Let me talk about that for a second. So I would, the reason that's important is because part of what I want to do here is I want to identify traits of disobedient people, right? So I would hypothesize that homeschool kids are more likely to intervene than public school kids, and if that was part of government school kids, yeah. If that was part of the survey and you could discern that about your subjects, you'd be able to show a statistical difference. It might be liberals and conservatives, it might be whatever, but if you know what those traits are, that becomes relevant data for activists to know not only like who they're pursuing with the liberty message, but also like what kind of upbringing, what kind of society you have to build for this sort of thing to be sustainable without power structures. Yeah.
I'm not a professional ethicist, as we are anarchists and we're against authority. I have a question, the whole concept of professional ethicists. I think everybody should be an ethicist.
Yeah. Did I say professional ethicist? I'm just not.
I have to revise the order. If my memory is taken, you did say it. I don't have a
okay.
Otherwise.
I guess what I mean is that there are people whose reputation establishes them as ethicists. Like I understand the non-aggression principle. I sort of think about ethics in my own daily life and my own daily actions, as everybody should. But for example, like Stefan Molyneux has this sort of reputation as an ethicist. He's made a career out of writing books on ethics, right? Oh, of course they do. But you want input from those kinds of people, and there aren't, as far as I know, very many people that make a career out of the study of ethics, if that makes sense. John?
It might be cool to have in the corner near the door where the police brutality is apparently going on, like a piece of furniture that can be picked up, or a club or something, to see if some people grab the club before they go in to level the playing field with the cop. That might be like an extra bonus.
Like even just a stool, a fire extinguisher.
You know that person was intending on it.
Oh, that's me. Spray one hit. Two fire extinguishers.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Well, yeah, but it's an opportunity for the subject to retaliate, but there's there's physically nobody to retaliate against, so there's no risk of injury.
Open the door and there's no one there, but now you have a whole other level.
Yeah, that also equalizes the problem that there's sort of a lot of people are saying it's not a perfect test because they're not intervening against an equal, they're intervening against somebody who is armed.
Well, you have it be both because you can see if there's a difference.
What about just make it be a mall cop?
Yeah. Make it a mall cop. That's actually, people laugh about that, but there have been studies on people's reactions to specific uniforms, and they've shown that private security does get more compliance than street clothes. So, I mean, it is sort of relevant. Yeah.
So I don't know what the regulations would be. What would this experiment look like if we were to follow the normal regulations? Where are we different?
I'm not sure. I think, well, part of it is I don't think that you can deceive them anymore. So in the Milgram experiment, they were deceived as to the point of the experiment, right? So
There's no
they.
data then without that.
What's that?
There's no data if you don't have that.
Brian, do you maybe know the answer to this one?
Yeah. The deception would be allowed by the APA and the other regulating agencies, but with a large amount of red tape. You can do that. It's very limited as to be very well justified. So if you submit a study for approval that contains deception of any kind, then you're going to be held to a lot of scrutiny, many safeguards to make sure that harm doesn't happen, and things like that.
Is that expensive?
The truth is, things like Stanford Prison Experiment, Milgram study would not be approved again. And that's where you're getting what you're saying is these studies that are a little weaker because that's what can get approved.
Right.
So it would be allowed in a form that isn't too difficult for the participants, but you're sort of expressing that you want it to be difficult, and that's they probably wouldn't accept it. This is something that they might do. They might get on board with enough paperwork.
I think would add a lot of legitimacy to write it, submit it, and when they don't approve it, then do it as something
To actually
else.
get it not approved before we start.
In fact, it gives you a springboard for the ethical guidelines because we start with their objections and we answer each one of them, and we can
That's
do
really
a body of APA objections and the voluntary.
That also that undermines the problem of that he was saying that anarchists lack legitimacy, because if we can say that we attempted to go through conventional channels and were rejected, then maybe that undermines that.
The normal channels, like an APA certified.
You just have to find somebody to do it. I'll sign off on it. Yeah. Oh yeah.
It seems like the APA, with their revised ethical guidelines, are actually protecting authority.
Yeah, I think so.
Is there dissension within the APA about this authoritarianism?
No, look, they have good intentions of keeping people safe. I think what is going on here is just that people like Davi are just saying, maybe we don't need to be as controlled. And in the spirit of libertarianism, maybe the idea is that we don't need them to understand how to keep people safe. That we understand this might be a little stressful for people, but can we design it in a way that's safe, not going to lead to trauma, without needing to use their official approval, and that we respect other human beings. We don't need them to tell us how to respect other human beings. That's how I interpreted everything that you're saying. Their guidelines do protect people from bad studies. The question is, maybe are they preventing studies that wouldn't really do much harm, that would also have a lot of benefit? That's possible because they're fairly strict.
Yeah, I think there is a libertarian issue with the initiation of fraud. In a study that involves deception. But it occurs to me that potentially something like this could be crowdfunded as part of a series of studies, and participants perhaps could be told that the series of studies, some of them may involve deception.
Right. Or ahead of time. Like if you kind of sign
without
up at the
specifying,
very beginning, you're going to
necessarily which particular studies or which particular type of deception, but just as kind of a
that might be. To come out the gate and say there's going to be a whole series of studies. This is much more of a financial investment, and so I feel like we would have to sort of like prove that we could do one before we could promise to do others, if that makes sense. Like Morgan Spurlock comes to mind. His first movie was Super Size Me. It was this documentary about 30 days on eating McDonald's. And then he took the success of that documentary and he turned it into the series 30 Days, where every episode was 30 days doing something else, right? But I'm willing to bet he pitched the documentary as one documentary at the beginning. So, I mean, if this succeeded and we had sort of a research company and we had sort of funding and we could realistically say we were going to continue doing an ongoing series of experiments, then that sounds realistic.
I think the point he's making, though, is that if you change the fraud from being something that's traumatic, like you have something that's not expected to be traumatic at all, no danger, no nothing, and you give them an idea that, all right, well, potentially I'm going to experience something deceptive or traumatic, the fraud that it's actually only now, this one moment, may change things. So if you said to them, all right, well, what we're going to do is we're going to show you a trailer for, it's a sequel to The Passion of the Christ. Okay. And so, you know,
Right.
they're expecting you're going to see something.
So are you willing to see video of potentially brutal behavior?
It's a very, very violent movie if you tell them that, and then the surprise, the fraud is very minimal indifference. Or if you say to them, all right, well, we're going to do a series of experiments, which may include lying to you, all those kind of things, and you explain all these different things, get their consent, and then you actually want to do one experiment.
Sure.
This one experiment.
Essentially, I just want to conclude. If you guys want to grab one of these have my email address on the first and the last page. And if you want to send me any of your concerns, any of your ideas, if you have names of people who you think would be good to collaborate, I'm open to all of these things. This idea is only 2 months old, so this is sort of the progress I've made in the last 2 months. And right now I'm sort of in a team building phase. So I'm looking for people to keep me honest, people to keep me scientifically rigorous and ethical, and especially people who can consult with me to make sure it's as good as possible. But we're about out of time, so I want to thank you all for coming. And have a good conference. Thanks.
When it comes to investing in precious metals, you need a source you can trust who offers you choices and empowers you to maximize your wealth. That's where Roberts & Roberts Brokerage can help. Roberts & Roberts is a trusted name in precious metals. Since 1977, Roberts & Roberts has been providing you with the finest gold and silver bullion, coins, rounds, and bars at genuine and honest prices. They make it easy to invest in precious metals and work with you to suit your investment needs. In addition to offering gold and silver for sale for US dollars, Roberts & Roberts Brokerage is now accepting Bitcoin in exchange for their quality precious metals products. To speak with a professional from Roberts & Roberts about investing in precious metals, call toll-free 800-874-9760. Write this number down, 800-874-9760. Visit Roberts & Roberts online at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. On behalf of Roberts & Roberts, here's hoping your day is as good as gold.